The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, and it told Sadie Beckett that everything her uncle had ever owned now belonged to her, including a homestead out in the Colorado Territory that she had never once laid eyes on. She stood in the narrow hallway of the boarding house in Kansas City, where she had lived for the past 3 years, the letter pressed flat against her palm, reading the words twice over just to be sure she had understood them correctly. Her uncle, Hector Beckett, had died without a wife or children of his own, and because Sadie was the last living Beckett, the land and the property and whatever stood upon it were hers by right. The attorney in Durango had written in careful, measured sentences that communicated very little warmth, informing her that the deed was registered, the title was clean, and that she had 90 days from the date of his writing to make her claim or the property would revert to the county. 90 days. Sadie folded the letter along its original creases and pressed it into the pocket of her apron, and then she stood very still in that hallway for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the boarding house around her. Mrs. Hallen's kitchen was already clattering with breakfast preparation. 2 of the other boarders were moving around upstairs. The street beyond the front window was beginning to fill with the ordinary noise of a Kansas City morning. She had been working as a seamstress for 3 years, sending small sums back to her mother's sister in St. Louis, sewing by lamplight until her fingers ached, and the thought of land of her own, even land she had never seen, even a homestead she knew nothing about, felt like something she did not quite have the right to want as badly as she immediately, desperately wanted it. She gave her notice at the boarding house that same afternoon. The journey to Durango took 11 days by train and then by stage, and when the stage finally rattled its way into town along a rutted red dirt road in late April, Sadie pressed her face to the window and tried to take it all in at once. Durango in 1883 was a town that had not quite decided what it wanted to be. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had come through only 2 years prior, and the town was still in the loose, energetic process of expanding outward in every direction at once. There were proper storefronts with painted signs, and there were still canvas-walled establishments that had not yet committed to permanence. There was a hotel and a livery stable and a general merchandise store, and a land office and a saloon and a church and a schoolhouse, and all of it sat in the wide rocky valley with the San Juan Mountains rising up behind it in layers of blue and gray and startling white at the peaks. The attorney, a thin man named Mr. Graves who wore a collar that was half a size too large for his neck, met her at his office and handed over the deed without ceremony. He had the manner of someone delivering disappointing news even when he was not, which Sadie found deeply unsettling. He told her the property was approximately 14 miles northeast of town, that it sat on 60 acres of mostly flat land with a creek running along the eastern boundary, and that the house and outbuildings had been vacant for close to 4 years since her uncle had ceased active work on the property due to his declining health. 4 years vacant. Sadie thanked him and walked out into the dusty afternoon sunlight with the deed in her hand and a hollow feeling beginning to open in her chest. She arranged a room at the hotel for a reasonable rate and spent the evening asking careful questions of the woman behind the front desk, a broad-shouldered, capable woman named Dolers who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. Dolers told her that the Beckett property was known locally as a place that had been left to go to pieces, which Sadie received without flinching. She told her that finding a man with a wagon who could take her out there in the morning would not be difficult, and that the general store owner, Mr. Farwell, was the best person to speak to about supplies and about who in the surrounding area could be trusted. She also said, with the particular tone of someone delivering information they consider useful but also slightly dramatic, that the man who had done most of the carpentry work on the original Beckett house and who knew the property better than almost anyone still living nearby was Isaiah Bishop, who ran a small ranch about 4 miles north of the Beckett land. Sadie filed the name away and went asleep. She slept better than she expected to. In the morning she ate a quick breakfast, spoke with Mr. Farwell at the general store, bought a sturdy pair of work gloves and a good length of rope and several other practical items. And by 8 o'clock she was seated on the bench of a borrowed wagon beside a weathered, largely silent man named Mr. Oates, who had agreed to drive her out to the property in exchange for 2 bits. The road out of town was rough, and Mr. Oates was not conversational, which suited Sadie well enough. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape open out around them as the town fell away behind. The Colorado Territory in late April was a complicated kind of beautiful. The land was dry and wide, and marked by low sage and pale grass and red rock formations that pushed up from the earth at unexpected angles. Far to the west, the mountains were still capped with snow. The sky was enormous and deeply blue, and moved with fast white clouds that threw shadows across the valley floor in shifting patches. When they turned off the main road onto a smaller track that wound northeast through a low stand of cottonwood trees, Sadie sat forward on the bench slightly. The cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out, their pale new green trembling in the morning breeze, and the creek that Mr. Graves had mentioned appeared on their right, glinting through the trees. And then the house came into view. Mr. Oates said nothing, which Sadie was grateful for, because it gave her a moment to absorb what she was seeing without having to manage anyone else's reaction to her own. The house was a 2-room structure of wooden board and batten construction, and it had the look of something that had once been well built, and then been methodically undone by time and weather and neglect. The roof had partially collapsed on the left side, the boards splitting inward along a line that suggested a heavy snow load had finally overwhelmed them. Several of the exterior boards on the south-facing wall had warped and pulled away from their framing, leaving gaps that let in light and wind and whatever else cared to enter. The front porch, which had been built with some evident attention and care judging by the turned posts that still stood, had lost 2 of its floorboards, and the railing had come completely detached on the right side and lay in the dry grass at an angle. The door itself was still standing and still hung, but it was clearly swollen in its frame, and the lower hinge had begun to pull away from the wood. Beyond the house there was a barn, or what had been a barn, and its condition was considerably worse than the house. The main structure still stood, but the side wall had partially collapsed and the large front door had come off entirely and was lying flat in the dirt. There was a second smaller outbuilding that might have been a smokehouse, and it seemed relatively intact. There was also, Sadie noticed, a kitchen garden area to the east side of the house that had gone completely to weeds, but the low stone border walls were still there, and the soil within them looked dark and workable, which was something. She climbed down from the wagon, landing in the dirt with both feet, and stood facing the house. Behind her, Mr. Oates cleared his throat. "You want I should wait," he said. "No, thank you," Sadie said. "I will find my own way back when I am ready." He accepted this and turned the wagon around without further commentary and headed back toward the road, and then it was just Sadie and the broken homestead and the wind moving through the cottonwood trees along the creek. She put on her work gloves and went to look at the house up close. She was still making her careful circuit of the structure, noting everything, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming along the track from the north. The rider came through the cottonwoods at a steady walk, a tall man on a bay horse, and when he came near enough for her to make out his features she could see that he was younger than she had expected, somewhere in his late 20s. She thought, broad in the shoulder, with dark hair and a clean-shaved jaw, and the kind of direct, attentive gaze that belongs to people who are accustomed to doing actual work. He wore a plain cotton shirt rolled to the elbows and worn canvas trousers and boots that had clearly covered a great deal of ground, and there was a leather tool belt hanging from the horn of his saddle. He pulled his horse to a stop at a respectful distance and removed his hat. He said, "I heard in town yesterday that someone had come to claim the Beckett property. I figured I would ride over and introduce myself." He paused, I am Isaiah Bishop. I ranch up the road a ways. Sadie pulled off one of her work gloves and extended her hand. Sadie Beckett, she said, this is my inheritance. He looked at the house and then back at her, and she could see him choosing his words with some care. I know it, he said. I know every board of that place. She studied him. Is that so? I helped your uncle build it, Isaiah said, stepping down from his horse and looping the reins over the remains of the porch rail in the easy way of a man who has done that exact motion 10,000 times. Hector Beckett was a good man. He hired me to do most of the finish carpentry when he first put it up, back in '76. I was 21 years old and he paid me fairly and fed me well, and that meant something. He looked at the roof where it had caved inward. It hurts me to see it like this. Something about the plainness of that admission struck Sadie as genuine in a way that cost him nothing to say and therefore meant something. She looked back at the house. I need to know honestly, she said, whether it can be saved. Isaiah stepped up onto the porch with the careful weight-testing step of someone who knows what a compromised floor feels like underfoot, moving around the missing boards with the ease of someone who knew where they were before he saw them. He put his hands on the doorframe, looked up at the roof line, pressed his palm to the exterior wall and leaned. The foundation is solid, he said, after a moment. Your uncle put good stone footings under this, and the main framing is still sound. The walls are repairable. The roof on the left side has to come off and be rebuilt, but the right side is fine and the ridge beam held. He turned and looked at her directly. The structure itself is honest. Everything wrong with it is surface and weathering. Nothing is rotted through at the bones. Sadie let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. Can I ask what your plans are? Isaiah said. For the property, I mean. She straightened her shoulders. I intend to live here, she said. I intend to work it. I have some money saved, not a great deal, but some. I know how to work. I do not know how to repair a collapsed roof or rebuild a barn, but I am capable of learning what I need to learn. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in that direct, attentive way, and she had the distinct sensation of being assessed for something more than she could immediately name. I told you I know every board of this place, he said. I meant that literally. I could walk into that house in the dark and tell you where every joint is and where every weak point is and what it needs. It would be. He paused, and she watched something move across his face that she could not quite read. It would be a satisfaction to me to see it put right, if you would accept help. Sadie looked at him for a long moment. She had learned in the years of her independence to be careful about accepting things from men she did not know, not because she had experienced outright danger, but because she understood that help given without clear terms had a way of accruing interest over time. What would you want in return? She asked, directly enough that she saw him blink. Nothing that isn't fair, he said, without any defensiveness. I have my own place and my own work. I'm not looking for anything that isn't freely offered. I would be glad to help you because your uncle was a good man, and because there is satisfaction in putting right something that should not have been let go. He held her gaze. But I understand the question and I am not offended by it. Sadie nodded slowly. Then I accept your help, she said, and I will find ways to be useful in return because I am not a person who takes without giving. He smiled then, a brief, genuine smile that changed the quality of his face entirely, made it warmer and younger at the edges, and he put his hat back on and said, "Let me show you what we are dealing with." They spent the rest of that morning going through the house board by board, and it was exactly as Isaiah had said it would be, a thorough inventory of damage, but none of it reaching the bones. He showed her where the roof had failed, tracing the progression of the damage with a calm expertise that she found deeply reassuring. He showed her which floorboards on the porch had rotted through versus which had merely come loose and could be renailed. He showed her where the door frame had swelled and told her it would need to be planed smooth and rehung. He showed her the kitchen, which was the most intact room in the house, with its cast-iron stove still standing in the corner and its shelving still attached to the walls, and told her that the stove would need cleaning and the flue checking, but was likely still serviceable. When they came back out onto the porch, Sadie had filled 2 pages of the small notebook she carried with notes and measurements, and she had a clearer picture of what the work would require than she had arrived with. "I can start on the roof within the week," Isaiah said. "I have materials at my place I can spare, and I know where to source what I need in town. The lumber yard on the west side of Durango carries good stock." "I will pay for all materials," Sadie said firmly. "I did not doubt it," he said, equally firmly, and she felt the warmth of being taken at her word. He left an hour later, promising to return in 3 days with tools and a plan for the roof work, and Sadie spent the rest of the afternoon alone on the property, walking the 60 acres, following the creek east along its cottonwood-shaded bank, checking the condition of the soil in the garden plot, standing at the northwest corner of the land and looking out at the mountains. The mountains were extraordinary. They were close enough that their texture was visible, the dark vertical striping of the pines on their lower slopes giving way to gray rock and then to snow. And against the afternoon sky, they had a weight and a presence that was almost conversational, as though they were aware of being looked at and were indifferent to it. Sadie had never been in country like this, and she felt something happen in her chest that she recognized as the beginning of attachment, which was both welcome and terrifying, because attachment is the mother of heartbreak. She walked back to the house and sat on the porch steps that were still solid and ate the bread and dried meat she had packed that morning, and she made a list. She was 26 years old. She had never owned a piece of ground in her life. The ground was broken, and so was the house, and so was the barn, and she had a limited amount of money and no experience with ranching or homesteading. But she had the deed in her pocket and 60 acres of creek-watered Colorado land, and the word of a man who knew every board of the place. She decided it was enough. She walked back to town before dark, following the road in the long golden light of a Colorado spring evening, and she arrived at the hotel with dust on her boots and a plan in her head, and she slept soundly again. Over the following 3 days, she established herself at the hotel on a weekly rate that Dolers negotiated with her employer on her behalf, which Sadie appreciated. She visited the general store and Mr. Farwell several more times, learning quickly that he was a reliable source of local knowledge as well as goods, and from him, she gathered a detailed picture of the surrounding community. She learned about the irrigation situation along the creek. Several other homesteaders used the same water source upstream, and there was an informal agreement about water rights that had been maintained without serious conflict for several years. She learned that the nearest neighbors of consequence were a family named Wardell about 2 miles south of the Beckett property, good people according to Mr. Farwell, hardworking and fair. She learned that Isaiah Bishop had a solid reputation in the area, that he had ranched the Bishop land for 6 years since inheriting it from his own father, that he ran cattle and kept a kitchen garden, and was known as someone who did what he said he would do. That last part she already suspected, but it was good to have it confirmed. Isaiah arrived at the homestead on the morning of the 4th day, as he had said he would, with a wagon loaded with lumber and tools, and a plan drawn in pencil on a piece of rough brown paper that he spread on the porch steps for Sadie to examine. He had also brought his hired man, a compact and capable young man of about 20 named Tomas, who worked on the Bishop Ranch and had agreed to help with the heavier work. Sadie had arrived an hour before them and had already cleared the debris from the kitchen floor and begun the process of sorting what was salvageable from what needed to go. And when Isaiah walked in and saw the progress she had made, he simply nodded and said, "Good," with a tone of satisfaction that she found she liked. They spent that first day on the roof. Isaiah and Tomas worked up top, pulling away the collapsed boards with an efficiency that spoke to long familiarity with physical labor, while Sadie worked below, clearing and stacking what could be reused and disposing of what could not. Isaiah called down instructions and observations periodically, not in the manner of someone directing a person beneath them, but in the manner of someone thinking out loud who expected to be listened to and answered, which was a distinction she noticed and appreciated. By mid-afternoon, they had the collapsed section of roof cleared down to the framing, and Isaiah had assessed what could be kept. He came down from the roof with sawdust in his hair and a length of broken rafter over his shoulder, and he and Sadie stood together looking up at the open sky from inside the house, the late afternoon sunlight cutting through the gap in long gold bars. "The ridge beam is good," he said. "3 of the rafters on this side have to be replaced entirely. The rest just need sister boards to strengthen them. We can close this up within the week if the weather holds." "Can I work up there?" Sadie asked. He turned to look at her, and she had the impression he was considering whether to treat the question as extraordinary, and then he decided not to, which told her something about him. "Can you keep your balance and follow instruction?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then yes," he said. She went up the following day, and the day after, and she was careful and she was useful, and she did not flinch from the height or the work. And she watched the expression on Isaiah's face shift gradually from measured respect to something warmer and less guarded, though he did not put words to it, and neither did she. On the 5th day of working together, they broke for the midday meal Sadie had taken to bringing food for both of them, arriving early enough each morning to have water heating on the salvaged camp stove she had set up in the kitchen. And they sat on the repaired section of porch, which Isaiah had refloored with new boards that were pale and clean against the weathered gray of the original wood. Tamaz had gone home at noon to attend to a ranch matter, and it was just the 2 of them, and the creek sound in the cottonwoods and the far blue mountains. Isaiah said, without particular preamble, "What brought you out here? You had no ties to Colorado that I know of." Sadie thought about the question as she ate. "I had a life in Kansas City that was entirely made of things that belonged to other people," she said finally. "The room I lived in was someone else's. The work I did made things that belonged to whoever paid for them. The city itself was never mine in any way that felt real." She paused. "When that letter came, I thought, here is something that is mine and no one else's, even if it is broken. Maybe especially because it is broken, because that means it needs me specifically." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "That is a good way to understand a place," he said. "Did you feel that about your own land?" she asked. He looked out toward the mountains. "My father built the Bishop place from nothing," he said. "He came out here in '68 with a wagon and a wife and about $40, and he put stone footings in the ground with his own hands. When he died and left it to me, I was 23, and I did not feel ready for it, but I also never once considered not keeping it." He turned the tin mug in his hands. "I think a piece of land that has had work put into it holds onto something of the people who worked it. Your uncle put years into this ground. He put his hands into every joint of this house. That does not go away because the boards get old and the roof comes in." Sadie looked at him for a long moment. "You are different from what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone helpful and competent and entirely practical," she said. "You are those things, but you also think about things in ways I did not anticipate." Something came into his face at that, a warmth that he did not hide quickly enough. "You are also different from what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone grateful and a little overwhelmed and asking for a lot of guidance," he said, with the ghost of a smile. "You are grateful and occasionally a little overwhelmed, but you have not asked for guidance once. You watch what I do and then you do it. Is that a complaint?" "It is the opposite of a complaint," he said. They worked through May together and the work was good. The roof came together clean and solid, new boards pale against the sky, and then they turned to the walls, working systematically around the exterior, pulling the warped boards and replacing them, nailing the loose ones back true and sealing the gaps. Isaiah showed Sadie how to use a drawknife to clean old weathered board edges so that new boards would sit flush against them, and she took to it with a concentration that he watched without appearing to watch. Tamaz joined them on the days when his own work allowed, and on those days they made faster progress, 3 people working together with a kind of easy rhythm that felt, Sadie thought, like something that had been established over years rather than weeks. The house was beginning to come back to itself. On a Saturday toward the end of May, Sadie arrived at the homestead in the early morning to find that Isaiah had already been there for some time and had begun clearing the collapsed side wall of the barn. She stopped her horse. She had purchased a steady-tempered bay mare from the Durango livery with the last of her savings and named her Hazel at the edge of the yard and watched him for a moment without him knowing she was there. He was working with an axe and a pry bar, systematically dismantling what could not be saved so that what could be saved was clear. He worked with a quiet efficiency and a kind of focus that was almost meditative, and in the morning light with the mountains at his back and his shirt dark at the shoulders with exertion, Sadie felt something shift inside her that she recognized as both inevitable and alarming. She had not come to Colorado looking for this. She had come for land and independence and work, and she had found all three, and those things were enough, or they should have been. She was not a woman who confused gratitude for something more, or help freely given for a claim. She had been careful about all of it, scrupulously careful, and the care had served her well. But watching Isaiah Bishop take apart the broken side of the barn, with the same patient attention he had given to every other piece of this property, and knowing that he had driven over from his own place before sunrise to start the work before she arrived, Sadie felt the care beginning to creak under its own weight like a board that had held long enough and was now deciding to admit the load. She rode into the yard and he looked up and said good morning and handed her the pry bar when she asked for it, and they worked through the morning without saying anything beyond what the work required. But the quality of the silence between them had changed, and she thought he felt it too. At midday he said, somewhat abruptly, "There is a dance at the Grange Hall in town next Saturday evening. If you were interested in going, I would be glad to ride in with you, if that is something you would want." Sadie set down the pry bar and looked at him. He was looking at the barn wall with an expression of careful neutrality that cost him some effort to maintain. "I would like that," she said. The neutrality dissolved. The smile that came in its place was unguarded and genuine and reached his eyes, and Sadie felt warmth move through her that she made no effort to conceal. "Good," he said. "That is good." They were at the dance hall by 8 o'clock on Saturday evening, arriving in Isaiah's wagon with Hazel tied behind, and Sadie had worn the blue dress she had brought from Kansas City, the nicest thing she owned, a good poplin with a fitted bodice that she had sewn herself, and she could tell by the way Isaiah looked at her when he handed her down from the wagon that she had judged the occasion correctly. The Grange Hall was lively. The Durango Grange had been organized the previous year, and the Saturday dances were a genuine community institution already, attended by ranchers and townspeople and their families, by young men and women who came in from the surrounding land on horseback and stayed until the fiddle player's arm gave out. Someone had strung paper lanterns along the interior rafters, and they threw warm orange light down over the moving couples and the stamping feet and the laughter. And it all smelled of sawdust and candle wax, and the faint pleasant sweetness of the cider that Mrs. Wardell Sadie had met Clara Wardell the week before and liked her immediately, was ladling out at the far end of the room. Isaiah introduced Sadie to people with a quiet pride that he probably was not fully aware of, and she met the Wardells properly, and the Farwells, and several ranching families whose names she filed carefully away, and a young schoolteacher named Helen Price who had come from Ohio the previous fall, and who immediately looked at Sadie with the expression of someone who has found an ally and intended to keep them. When the dancing started, Isaiah held out his hand and Sadie took it. He was a good dancer in the way of people who learned by doing rather than by instruction, not polished, but sure, with a natural sense of rhythm and a light enough hand in the lead that she could respond rather than merely follow. They danced two figures together and then separated as the caller reorganized the room, and Sadie found herself partnered with Mr. Wardell, who was a solid, friendly man with enormous hands, and then with Mr. Farwell's son, who was 17 and deeply embarrassed to be there, and then with a bearded man named Colton who ran cattle south of town, and who told her 3 times in the span of one figure that her land had good water access, and that if she was ever minded to sell, he would offer a fair price. Sadie thanked him politely and did not pursue the conversation, and when she found herself back beside Isaiah at the edge of the dance floor, she told him about it and watched his jaw tighten slightly. "Colton has been wanting that creek access for years," he said. "He made the same approach to your uncle twice. He is going to be disappointed again," Sadie said. Isaiah looked at her with that warm directness. "Good," he said simply. They walked back to the wagon under a sky full of stars that were different in Colorado from any stars Sadie had seen before, bigger, somehow, and closer, and arranged in the clear dark with a generosity that she found almost absurd, as though someone had been extravagant with them. Isaiah helped her up to the bench and then climbed up himself, and they sat together for a moment before he took up the reins, the sounds of the hall still carrying out to them, and in the warm dark he said, very quietly, "I have been glad of this, Sadie, these weeks, working on the place." She turned to look at him. His profile against the stars was clean and serious. "I have been glad of it too," she said, "more than I expected to be." He turned then and met her eyes, and the moment held between them like something balanced. And then he looked back at the road and picked up the reins, and they drove back through the starlit dark. And when he left her at the hotel and rode on toward his own property, Sadie sat on the edge of her hotel bed for a long time without being able to say precisely what she was feeling, only that it was large and warm, and that it occupied considerably more room than she had planned for. June came, and the Colorado summer opened out over the land in long, bright days and warm nights, and the work on the homestead continued. The barn was the big project of the month. Isaiah had salvaged enough good lumber from the collapsed sections to use as framing for the rebuilt wall, and Tomaz's brother Felipe came out to help on several of the heavy lifting days, a quiet and skilled man who worked with the same steady competence as his brother. Clara Wardell rode over one afternoon with her eldest son, a boy of 12 named Eli, who was tremendously useful for the kind of work that required someone small enough to get into tight spaces, and she and Sadie talked while the men worked, a real conversation of the kind that Sadie had been hungry for since she arrived. Clara had been in the territory for 8 years and knew the land and its rhythms in detail, and she shared that knowledge generously. Clara also watched Isaiah with an expression of amused affection that told Sadie she was not the only one who had noticed the way things were developing. "He has been different this spring," Clara said, on the afternoon when she and Sadie were sitting on the newly repaired porch with cups of the coffee Sadie had made on the kitchen stove, which was now clean and fully operational, producing excellent heat and a faint smell of wood smoke that Sadie had already begun to think of as the smell of home. "Isaiah, I mean. He has always been a good neighbor and a decent man, but this spring he has been lighter." Sadie kept her expression even. "I am glad the work has been satisfying for him." Clara made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "I am sure the work has been very satisfying," she said. The barn wall was completed in the second week of June, and it stood straight and solid, and Isaiah ran his hand along the new siding boards with an expression of quiet satisfaction that Sadie had come to recognize and love. They patched the barn roof the following week and rehung the large front doors on new hardware, and when they swung those doors open on a warm Tuesday morning and stood looking at the clean swept interior with its re-leveled floor and its repaired stall dividers, Sadie felt a fullness in her chest that was almost painful. "It is a good barn," Isaiah said. "It is a very good barn," Sadie agreed. He turned to look at her. They were standing close together in the barn doorway, the morning light warm on their shoulders, and the distance between them was less than it had been at any point in the weeks they had been working together, and she could see him deciding something. "Sadie," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to tell it to you plainly because I think you prefer plainness to anything else." "I do," she said. He held her gaze steadily. I have thought about very little other than you for the past 2 months, he said. I have found every possible reason to be on this property when there was work to be done, and some reasons when there was not. I have thought about the way you work and the way you think and the way you look at the mountains when you think no one is watching you, and I have thought about the dance, and about all the conversations we have had while doing things with our hands, and I am telling you this now, because I think it would be dishonest not to. Sadie felt her heart doing something complicated and unhurried and certain all at once. She looked at him for a long moment in the barn doorway with the Colorado summer bright around them. I have thought about very little other than you either, she said, since approximately the first week. Something broke open in his face in the most wonderful way. He reached out and took her bare hand, since she had not yet put on her work gloves that morning, and he held it in both of his, and she felt the warmth of that entirely with her whole body, standing in the doorway of the barn they had built back together. I would like to court you, he said, properly, if that is something you would welcome. It is something I would very much welcome, she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, brief and warm and serious, and Sadie stood in the doorway of her barn in the Colorado summer, and felt the full weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. They courted through June and into July in the way of people who are already deeply known to each other through work and honesty, not tentatively, not with the elaborate formal distance of people feeling their way toward a stranger, but with the ease of people who have already established the bones of something and are now learning the finer details. Isaiah brought her wildflowers he had picked along his morning ride over, leaving them on the porch steps before she arrived, yellow and white, and the pale purple of wild clover. Sadie baked a deep-dish apple pie with dried apples she had bought at Farwell's store and brought it to his ranch when he invited her to see the place, and he showed her everything with a pride that was entirely free of pretension. The small stone house his father had built, the cattle pasture with its creekwater access, the kitchen garden that was admittedly less tended than hers but was productive enough, the stable where his bay horse, whose name she learned was Grant, stood in clean straw. His ranch was modest and well cared for, and it had the feeling of a place that a person had worked at with consistent attention over time, and she recognized in it the same quality of honest effort she had been putting into her own property, and found it deeply appealing in a way she could not have precisely articulated if asked to. She asked him once, on the ride back to her homestead after the visit, whether he ever felt lonely out here. He considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. There were years when I did, he said, the first 2 after my father died mostly. The ranch needed so much, and I was working most of my waking hours, and there was no one to tell anything to at the end of a day. He looked at the road ahead. It stopped feeling like loneliness eventually and started feeling like quiet, which is different. But I think I have always known there was something the quiet was waiting for. Sadie turned that over in her mind and found it exactly right. One July afternoon, when the heat was lying heavy over the land and the creek was low and bright between its cottonwood banks, they walked along the water together after the day's work was done. There was still work. There was always still work. The smaller outbuildings needed attention, and the garden plot needed establishing, and the fence lines needed checking, and Isaiah stopped walking and turned to face her. He took her face in his hands with a gentleness that surprised her by its completeness, and he kissed her. It was a warm, careful, entirely certain kiss, and when it ended she opened her eyes and found him looking at her with an expression so unguarded and so full that she pressed her hand flat against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, and said his name. Sadie, he said back, as though he had been waiting a long time to say it like that. They stood by the creek in the afternoon heat with the cottonwoods moving around them and the mountains visible in the far distance, and she thought, this is what the inheritance was for. Not only the land and the house and the barn, but this specific afternoon beside this specific creek, with this specific man who had known every board of a place before she did, and then helped her learn it herself. In August the garden produced its first real yield, which was tomatoes and summer squash and pole beans, and Sadie spent an entire Saturday canning with Clara Wardell in the Beckett kitchen, the two of them working through the heat of the afternoon with the stove going, and the windows open and conversation running alongside the work like a second stream. Clara told her about the early years in the territory, the winter of '79 that had frozen cattle out of whole sections of range, the way the community had organized around the railroad's arrival, the complicated situation with water rights that the county was still trying to formalize. She also told Sadie, with characteristic directness, that the entire community was waiting for Isaiah Bishop to make his intentions toward her explicit and formal, and that the collective patience on this matter was beginning to be tested. Sadie laughed at that, a genuine, full laugh that she could hear echoing off the kitchen walls. "We are working on it," she said. "I am very glad to hear it," Clara said. It was the following weekend that Isaiah rode over on a Sunday afternoon when there was no work planned, just riding, which was one of the things they had begun doing together, riding the surrounding country simply for the pleasure of it, learning the landscape in the way you can only learn it from horseback. He arrived at the homestead, where Sadie was sitting on the repaired porch with a letter she was writing to her mother's sister in St. Louis. And when she looked up from the letter, she saw that he had something on his mind beyond the pleasure of riding. He came up onto the porch and sat on the step below her chair, and she put down the letter and waited. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I want my life to look like." "That seems useful," she said. He turned around on the step to face her. "I want it to look like you," he said. "I want to be working on land that we both care about and coming home to the same place at the end of the day and knowing that you are there. I want the house and the ranch and this homestead and everything that grows here and everything we build here to be something we build together." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Sadie, plainly and without pretense, because that is how I know to do things." Sadie looked at him in the August afternoon, this man who had shown up at her broken inheritance with a tool belt and a knowledge of every board and a willingness to work alongside her without claiming any of it for himself, and she felt love for him as a solid and settled thing, not turbulent but deep, like the foundation stones her uncle had put in the ground before she was born. "Yes," she said, plainly and without pretense. "Yes." He stood up from the step and she stood from the chair, and he put his arms around her and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the smell of him, sun warmth and wood and horse, and the particular clean sweat of a working man. And the homestead was around them with its repaired walls and its solid new roof and its barn with the straight-hung doors. And the garden was producing, and the creek was running, and the mountains were standing in their permanent, generous way to the west. They were married in September 1883 at the Durango Church, on a Saturday morning that was cloudless and golden with the particular quality of Colorado autumn light, which has a clarity to it that seems to sharpen every edge and warm every surface it touches. Sadie wore the blue poplin dress, which she had carefully pressed, with her mother's silver pin at the collar, which was the only piece of jewelry she owned. Isaiah wore his good wool jacket and a clean white shirt, and his hair was combed, and he stood at the front of the church with the look of a man who has arrived at the exact right place. Clara Wardell stood up with Sadie, and Tom Wardell stood with Isaiah, and Helen Price sat in the front pew and wept happy tears that she did not attempt to conceal, which Sadie found enormously endearing. Mr. Farwell and his wife were there, and several of the ranching families, and Tomás and Felipe and their families, and the church was full in the warm way of a community that has known something was coming and is glad to see it arrive. The pastor spoke briefly and sincerely, and they said their vows to each other with the directness that was native to both of them, looking each other in the eye all the way through. And when Isaiah kissed her, the small congregation made a sound of collective satisfaction that was almost musical. The reception was at the Grange Hall, as weddings in Durango tended to be, and it went long and happily, with the same fiddle player from the spring dance providing music and Mrs. Wardell's cider flowing freely, and a great deal of food that various members of the community had contributed. Isaiah danced with Sadie until her feet ached, and then they danced some more, and the lanterns were warm overhead, and the mountains were dark masses against the star-bright sky outside the open doors. They drove home to the Beckett homestead in the dark, not to his ranch, because they had discussed it and decided together that they would make the homestead their primary home, combining the two properties' resources and working both. Isaiah's ranch would be kept and the cattle maintained, with Tamaz continuing to manage the daily work there. But the house they would live in and the land they would pour themselves into was the Beckett land, because it was the land that had needed them both most, and because it was, as Sadie had said, a place that had held onto something of the person who built it and was waiting to hold the same of them. When they walked in through the front door that night, the door that Isaiah had planed and rehung smooth in its frame in May, that swung open with barely the weight of a hand and sat flush against its threshold, the house felt different than it ever had. It felt inhabited. It felt like a place where people were going to live. Isaiah lit the lamp in the kitchen and they stood in the light of it together in their wedding clothes, and he said, "We are home." "We are home," Sadie agreed. The autumn of 1883 was a season of consolidation. They had the homestead functioning as a proper working property by October, with the kitchen garden put to bed for winter after producing more than Sadie had dared hope, the barn stocked with the first small hay supply, and the fence lines repaired and extended. Isaiah brought a small herd of 6 cattle from his north ranch to winter on the better-watered Beckett pasture, and they together built a second cattle shelter behind the barn over the course of 3 weekends in October, working in the chill of the autumn mornings with their breath coming in white clouds and the first frost already whitening the grass at dawn. The house was warm. The stove in the kitchen drew beautifully through the cleaned flue and heated the whole structure through the 2 interior rooms, and Sadie lined the interior walls of the bedroom with the heavy flannel curtaining she had sewn herself, and the cold that came in off the mountains at night was held at bay by the combination of good wood and good work. She wrote to her mother's sister in St. Louis and told her she was married and that she owned land and that she was happy in a way she had never expected to be. And the letter she received back was warm and a little astonished and entirely loving, which made Sadie sit at the kitchen table with her hand over her mouth for a long moment. Isaiah noticed and came to sit beside her. "Good news," he said. "My family is happy for me," she said. "I did not realize until this moment how much I needed to know that." He put his arm around her shoulders. "They should be happy for you," he said. "You built something worth being happy about." "We built it," she said. "We did," he agreed. In November, a situation arose that required navigation. The man named Colton, who had approached Sadie at the spring dance about buying the property, came to call at the homestead on a cold gray morning, when Isaiah was over at the North Ranch, dealing with a fence that had come down in the recent wind. He arrived in a wagon with another man Sadie did not recognize, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and he was perfectly polite. But his purpose was clear. He wanted the creek access on the eastern boundary of the Beckett land, and he was prepared to offer what he described as a generous price for either the water rights specifically or the eastern 20 acres with the creek running through them. Sadie stood in the doorway with her arms folded and heard him out completely before she responded. "Mr. Colton," she said, when he had finished, "I appreciate that you have come in person and that you have been courteous about this. I want to be equally courteous in return." She paused. "The answer is no. The creek is part of this property and part of what makes this property work, and I have no interest in selling any portion of the land. If you need additional water access for your cattle, I would suggest speaking to the county about the possibilities further upstream, which is a conversation I believe Mr. Farwell would know how to point you toward." Colton looked at her for a moment. He was not a bad man, she thought, simply a persistent one with a clear objective. He put his hat back on. "I understand," he said, "if you change your mind." "I will not change my mind," Sadie said pleasantly, "but you are welcome to ride this road any time." She told Isaiah about it that evening, and he listened with his jaw tight in the way it did when he was suppressing a strong reaction. "He should not have come when he knew I was not here," he said. "I handled it," Sadie said. "I know you did," he said. "I am not suggesting otherwise. I am saying he knew what he was doing in coming when I was away, and I do not like that." "It was a business proposition delivered to the property owner," she said, gently. "I am the property owner. I declined it." "It is done." He looked at her for a moment and then let the tension go. "You are right," he said. "I know you are right. You are allowed to not like it," she said. "I did not particularly like it either. But it is handled." He nodded and reached across the table to cover her hand with his, and they ate their supper in the warm kitchen with the stove making its reliable sounds and the wind pushing against the newly solid walls outside, and the matter was closed. Winter came to the Colorado Territory in December with a gravity that Sadie had not been fully prepared for even after everything Isaiah had told her about it. The first real snow fell in the second week of December, and it did not stop for 3 days. And when it stopped, the world outside the windows was a different world entirely, muffled and immense, and the exact white of new paper, with the mountains invisible behind solid gray cloud. Isaiah worked through the storm with the calm practicality of someone who has done this before, checking the cattle and the horses every few hours, keeping the paths between the house and the barn clear, managing the feed with the careful economy that a Colorado winter required. Sadie worked alongside him, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she loved the winter. She loved the enforced closeness of it, the way the storm drew everything inward, the way the kitchen was warm when everything outside was cold, the way evenings were long and lamplight, and the way she and Isaiah talked in those evenings with a depth and a ease that the busier seasons did not always allow. She loved waking to find him already up and the fire made and coffee hot, and she loved the specific quality of his face in winter firelight, the way it made him look both more and less serious than usual, stripped of the squinting brightness of the outdoor workday. She told him once in January that she was happy, and he set down the mending he was working on. He was as handy with a needle as she was, which she had discovered was a practical skill that came of years of single living, and looked at her with such complete attention that she felt it physically. "I want to keep making you happy," he said, "for the rest of my life. I want that to be the project." "It is a good project," she said, leaning across and pressing a kiss to the corner of his mouth. "It is my best project," he said. Spring came around again in 1884, and with it, the business of the second planting season, which Sadie approached with a much more confident and detailed plan than her first improvised summer garden had allowed for. She expanded the kitchen garden by half again, putting in seed potatoes and onions and carrots and parsnips alongside the summer crops, and she established a separate small plot for herbs sage and thyme and chamomile, and the spearmint that Clara Wardell had given her a root of in the fall, and that was already coming up in bright determined green along the stone border. Isaiah built her a proper cold frame against the south side of the house, using salvaged glass panes he had found at the lumber yard, and a careful frame of planed wood, and in it she started seedlings in February that went into the ground in April as sturdy young plants rather than seed, which gave her a considerable head start on the season. She felt a deep and specific satisfaction about this that she shared with Isaiah on the evening she planted the first tomato seedlings out, standing in the garden with soil on her gloves and the late April sun warm on her back. "I think I might be a farmer," she said. Isaiah looked around at the expanded, carefully organized garden with its full beds and its cold frame and its neatly marked rows. "I think you might be the best farmer in La Plata County," he said. She laughed. "That is a significant overstatement." "I stand by it," he said. In the spring of 1884, Sadie also discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Isaiah on a Tuesday evening in early April when the mountains were pink with sunset, and they were sitting together on the porch after supper. She had known for several weeks and had wanted to be certain before she said anything, which was her nature, to be sure of things before she made them real with words. He was very still for a moment when she told him. Then he turned to her and she could see in the firelight from the open kitchen door that his eyes were full. "Sadie," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I know," she said, and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her and held her against his side, and they sat on the porch they had rebuilt together and looked at the mountains in the last of the light. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "I am also very glad." "I am very glad too," he said. "I am going to be there for all of it. I want you to know that, whatever it needs." She believed him completely. The pregnancy progressed through the spring and summer without serious difficulty, though the heat of July was trying, and the weight of August was heavier than she had anticipated. And Isaiah was as present as he had promised, quietly reconfiguring the daily work so that she was never doing anything that required more than she had to give at any given moment without making a notable production of it, which she appreciated because she would have found notable production of it extremely irritating. Clara Wardell was invaluable. She had 4 children and a broad and practical knowledge base regarding childbearing and childrearing in the territory, and she came over regularly with advice and company, and on several occasions with food, which Sadie accepted without false pride because Clara's cooking was exceptional, and because there were days when standing at the stove for more than half an hour was simply more than the situation called for. Their son was born in November 1884, on a cold, clear night with frost on the windows, and Isaiah holding her hand so firmly she thought later that he might have left marks, though she had been holding his equally hard, and so it was only fair. The midwife Clara had recommended, a calm and capable woman named Mrs. Hoover, who had delivered half the children in the county, arrived before dark and was steady and reassuring throughout. The boy was born at close to midnight, and he was loud and dark-haired and absolutely furious about existing in the cold November air. And when Isaiah held him for the first time, he stood at the side of the bed in the lamplight with their son in his arms and looked at Sadie with an expression of such stunned and overwhelming love that she started to cry, which surprised her, because she was not typically a person who cried. "What will we name him?" Isaiah asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I thought Hector," Sadie said. "After my uncle." Isaiah looked at her. "Hector," he said, trying the name. He looked down at the baby. "Yes, that is right." Hector Beckett Bishop came home to the repaired homestead on a November morning, when the first real winter snow was just beginning to come down over the mountains, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were bare and silver. And he was placed in the cradle that Isaiah had built over the course of the autumn evenings. With the same care he brought to everything, he made good pine with smooth-fitted joints and a gentle rocker base. And he slept in it with the profound indifference to fine craftsmanship that is characteristic of very small people. The homestead, which had arrived to Sadie as a collapsed and weathered thing at the end of a rough track, now had a repaired and tight-roofed house, and a solid new barn, and a productive garden, and a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and good cooking, and a cradle in the corner of the bedroom. And on the best evenings it also had lamplight and conversation, and the sound of someone else breathing nearby, which is a sound that Sadie had not understood until she had it how much she had been missing. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was hard in the way that Colorado winters are hard, long, cold, requiring consistent work and careful resource management. The cattle came through it well under Isaiah and Tomaz's management. The root cellar Sadie had established in the fall held an impressive store of preserved vegetables and dried goods that she regarded with satisfaction on the days when going to town was not possible, and the supply of fresh things was what they had grown and put up themselves. Hector was a good baby in the primary sense, sturdy and healthy and interested in the world around him. But he was not a quiet one, and the winter evenings in the small, warm house had a different quality than they had the year before. A fuller, louder, more demanding quality that Sadie found both exhausting and completely worth it. Isaiah was the kind of father she had perhaps hoped he would be, but had not let herself count on. Present and capable and genuinely interested, willing to walk the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning with a screaming infant without complaint and apparently without resentment, able to quiet the boy in ways that even Sadie sometimes could not, some combination of the low, steady sound of his voice and the particular way he held him. "You are very good at this," Sadie told him one evening when he had settled Hector from a bad spell of crying in about 10 minutes flat, and was sitting in the kitchen chair with the sleeping baby against his shoulder and the most content expression she had ever seen on his face. "He just needs to know someone is there," Isaiah said quietly, "not to startle the sleeping child. That is most of what any of us need." She stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the two of them in the lamplight. Her husband and her son in the house they had made real together. And she thought about the Tuesday morning in the hallway of the Kansas City boarding house with the letter in her hand and the hollow feeling in her chest. And she thought about the first sight of the broken homestead from the wagon bench. And she thought about Isaiah coming through the cottonwood trees on his bay horse on that first morning and saying, "I know every board of that place." She thought about what it meant that all of it had led here, to this specific kitchen, to this specific man and this specific child and this specific night, and she felt something that was not quite describable settle into its final position in her chest, the way the last board of a well-built thing drops into place. Spring 1885 came in early and mild, and with it, a decision. Isaiah had been managing both the homestead and his North Ranch, with Tamaz handling the North Place primarily, for close to 2 years, and the logistics had worked but had required more back and forth than was entirely comfortable, especially with Hector in the picture. He and Sadie talked it over at length over several evenings while the baby slept, and they decided together to consolidate. The North Ranch, the Bishop place his father had built, would be sold, the cattle brought fully down to the Beckett homestead pasture, and the income from the sale would go into improving the homestead's cattle capacity, expanding the pasture fencing, and improving the water infrastructure along the creek. It was not a small decision. The Bishop place had been in his family since 1868, and Isaiah had lived there for his entire adult life. Sadie made sure he understood that she was not asking for it, that the arrangement could continue as it was if he needed it to. He said very simply, "Home is here. Home has been here since you gave me the door to walk through. I do not need the other place." So the North Ranch was sold in May 1885 to a family named Greer who had come in from New Mexico and wanted good established land with creek access, and they paid a fair price and they were good people, and the transition was smooth. Tamaz came to work full-time on the Beckett homestead, which now had enough cattle and enough land to genuinely need him, and Felipe came several days a week to help with the heavier ongoing work. The homestead that had been broken and empty in the spring of 1883 was, by the summer of 1885, a working ranch of 60 acres with a sound house and a solid barn and good cattle and a productive garden, run by 2 people who knew every inch of it between them. In the late summer of 1885, something happened that reminded Sadie of the larger world the homestead existed within. A dispute broke out between several of the upstream water users and the county, as the county was in the process of formalizing the water rights that had previously been managed by informal agreement. The process was complicated and not always fair, and it became apparent fairly quickly that the formal adjudication was likely to disadvantage the smaller homesteaders in favor of the larger established ranching operations that had the resources to navigate the legal process more effectively. Isaiah attended the county meeting on this matter in Durango and came home with a measured fury that she could feel under his ordinary surface. The homesteaders upstream from the Beckett property were going to be pushed toward inferior senior rights in the formal registration. He told her, not because their use was less established, but because they had less capacity to make the legal arguments. "What can we do?" Sadie asked. "We can document," he said. "All of us who have been using this water can document our use going back to when it started, and we can make the case collectively that the informal system reflects actual established use. I spoke to Mr. Farwell tonight and he agrees. He can coordinate with the families involved." Sadie thought for a moment. "I can help with the documentation," she said. "I write clearly and I understand how to make a logical case on paper. And my deed goes back to when Uncle Hector established the original use, which is 1876. That is 9 years of prior use. That ought to count for something." Isaiah looked at her across the kitchen table. "It will count for a great deal," he said. "Will you do it?" "Obviously," she said. She spent the better part of 3 weeks that fall writing careful, detailed documentation of the water use history on the Beckett property, drawing on what she had learned from Mr. Graves's original deed materials and what Clara Wardell and other long-standing neighbors could confirm about the creek's history. She coordinated with 4 other Homestead families through written correspondence and 2 visits, gathering their histories and organizing them into a coherent collective submission. The formal adjudication took place in November, and the submission Sadie had prepared, which Isaiah and Mr. Farwell and 2 of the other homestead owners presented at the county offices, was received as substantive and well-organized evidence. The final determination was not perfect, but it was significantly better for the smaller landholders than it would have been without the documentation, and the creek access that the Beckett property depended on was formally registered with full senior rights status. Isaiah came home from the final county session with the registered water rights certificate in his hand and the expression of a man who has just won something that mattered. "You did that," he told her, setting the certificate on the kitchen table. "We did that," she said. "You wrote every word of it," he said. "Sadie, you protected this land." She looked at the certificate and felt a sharp, bright pride. "Uncle Hector established the use," she said. "I just made sure the county knew it." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, and she kissed him back. And Hector, who was almost 1 year old and had recently discovered that banging a wooden spoon against the floor produced an enormously satisfying noise, banged his spoon against the floor with enthusiasm, which broke the kiss and made them both laugh. Winter 1885 into 1886 was gentler than the previous years, and Sadie used the longer evenings to begin something she had been thinking about since the summer: a systematic record of the homestead's work and production. She kept a detailed ledger of the garden's output, the cattle numbers, the expenditures and income, the work done to the property and when, and she found the record-keeping deeply satisfying in the way that all thorough documentation is satisfying, as a way of making the real visible and the temporary permanent. She also, in the long January evenings with Hector asleep and Isaiah reading or working on small repairs at the kitchen table, began writing letters to her mother's sister's eldest daughter, a young woman of 20 named Rose, who was in circumstances similar to what Sadie's had been, working in a city, owning nothing, and she described honestly and carefully what it had meant to come to the territory and build something. She did not romanticize the hardship. She also did not minimize the rewards. Rose eventually came to visit in the summer of 1886, which was a whole story in itself. She arrived on the stage from Durango with a traveling bag and a wary expression that gave way, over the course of 2 weeks on the homestead, to the same mixture of exhaustion and elation that Sadie remembered from her own first season. Rose was sharp and capable, and she fell in love with the mountains with an immediacy that Sadie recognized, because she had felt it herself. She also, in the way of things, met Felipe at a Grange Hall dance, and that was the beginning of something that would take another year to resolve, but that was, from the start, entirely obvious to everyone watching. In the autumn of 1886, Sadie discovered she was expecting again, which she announced to Isaiah on a September evening while they were walking the pasture fence and checking the line before winter, Hector toddling ahead of them on his new and enthusiastic legs, falling every fourth step with perfect equanimity and getting back up. Isaiah stopped walking and looked at her with the same stunned, full expression she remembered from the first time. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He reached out and pulled her against him, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they stood in the pasture in the September afternoon, watching their son walk and walk again toward the fence line, and the mountains were golden and red with the beginning of autumn color, and the cattle were in the near pasture, and the barn was solid, and the house was warm behind them. "Are you glad?" he asked. "I am enormously glad," she said. Their daughter came in May 1887, in the full flood of a Colorado spring, and they named her Ruth, after Isaiah's mother. She was quieter than her brother at birth, but made up for it by the time she was 3 months old, and she had her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and a fixed, evaluating gaze that she deployed on everyone who approached her with an expression that Sadie found simultaneously hilarious and deeply familiar. "She looks at people exactly the way you do," Isaiah told her, when Ruth was fixing this gaze on Mr. Farwell at the general store during their first trip to town. "Is that a complaint?" Sadie said. "It is the opposite of a complaint," Isaiah said, in the exact tone he had used when she had asked him the same question on the porch in May 1883, which was not lost on either of them. He took her hand across the counter while Mr. Farwell wrapped their purchases, and she squeezed it, and that was enough. The homestead continued to grow and to improve in the years that followed. By 1888, they had expanded the cattle operation to 30 head, added a proper smokehouse to replace the small original one, and built a new outbuilding that functioned as a combined workshop and storage space. Tamaz had married, and his wife, a warm and energetic woman named Celia, became part of the community of the homestead in the way that the territory's ranching life tended to create, which was not quite family and not quite hired help, but something more complex and specific and good. Rose and Felipe married in 1887 and took up a small homestead of their own about 6 miles east, and the connection between the two properties was maintained through regular visits and the exchange of labor and goods that was the currency of territory life. Helen Price, the schoolteacher, left Durango in the spring of 1888 to marry a man in Denver, and Sadie and Clara threw her a farewell supper that ended with everyone at the table telling stories until nearly midnight. And the parting was sad in the way that all real partings are sad, but was held up by the knowledge of what Helen was going to. The years layered themselves over the homestead, and the family with the accumulating weight of good work and ordinary love. Hector learned to ride on a gentle pony Isaiah found at the fall sale in 1888, a spotted gray named Cloud, and he rode with the natural ease of a child raised on land, which was exactly what he was. Ruth walked at 10 months and talked at 12, in the manner of a person who had been waiting for the technology to become available and intended to use it extensively. And by the time she was 2, she was conducting detailed negotiations over her dinner vegetables that Sadie found impressive and Isaiah found hilarious. In the spring of 1889, Sadie turned 32 years old, and Isaiah baked her a cake, a reasonable chocolate cake using cocoa powder from Farwell's store, somewhat lopsided but enormously sincere, and they ate it on the porch on a warm April evening with Hector and Ruth. And the mountains were in their spring clarity, and the garden was just beginning to green up, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in their new leaf pale gold, and it was a good birthday, possibly the best birthday of her life. She told Isaiah so, and he said he intended to make the next one better, and the one after that indefinitely, and she told him that was a very ambitious program, and he said he was a very ambitious person when it came to her happiness specifically. And she laughed, and he kissed the side of her face, and Ruth, who was 2 and watchful, said, "Papa doing?" And Hector, who was 4 and had opinions, said kissing, obviously, with a world weariness that set them both laughing again. In the summer of 1889, the Colorado Territory officially became the state of Colorado, admitted to the Union as the 38th state, and Durango celebrated with genuine and somewhat excessive enthusiasm that included fireworks purchased from a traveling merchant at considerable expense, and set off in the field behind the Grange Hall to the collective delight of everyone present. Isaiah held Ruth on his shoulders so she could see, and Hector stood between his parents with his head tilted back watching the colored bursts with an expression of total commitment to the experience. And Sadie stood in the warm July dark with her husband's arm around her waist, and the fireworks overhead, and the crowd of neighbors and friends around them. And she thought about the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday morning in the hallway of a Kansas City boarding house. She thought about Mr. Graves, the thin attorney with the large collar, handing her the deed without ceremony. She thought about Mr. Oates driving her out to the property without conversation, and the moment when the house first came into view, its collapsed roof and warped walls and the porch rail lying in the dry grass. She thought about standing in the dirt of the yard and deciding it was enough. And then she thought about hoofbeats through the cottonwoods and a bay horse coming to a stop at a respectful distance, and a man getting down from the saddle and removing his hat, and saying, "I know every board of that place." She turned her face against Isaiah's shoulder, briefly, just for a moment, and he felt it and pressed his lips to the top of her head and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. They drove home in the summer dark with their children asleep against each other in the wagon bed, all the way along the road that Sadie had walked alone that first April with dust on her boots and a plan in her head, past the cottonwoods and across the creek, and up to the solid house with its lights burning in the window. They carried the children in and put them to bed and moved quietly through the house together in the warm dark, the way people move through a space they know completely, every board and every joint and every particular creak of floorboard, until they stood in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and the late summer night warm around the house. "Isaiah," Sadie said. He looked at her, waiting. "This is the life I wanted," she said. "When I read that letter in Kansas City with the hollow feeling in my chest, I wanted something, but I did not know what it was specifically enough to name it. I know now. This is exactly it. The land and the house and the work and you and our children and all of it." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted to tell you that." He crossed the kitchen to her in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, the same way he had that afternoon by the creek in the summer of 1883, and he held her face and looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "And I want you to know that you are the thing I did not know I was missing until the day I rode through those cottonwood trees and found you standing in the dirt of your broken inheritance with your work gloves on and a notebook in your hand, absolutely determined to make something of it." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You were the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen, and you have gotten more extraordinary every day since." "You are a very good husband," she said, in a voice that was somewhat less steady than usual. "I plan to continue," he said. She laughed and pressed her palms flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, the way it had been when she had pressed her hand there the first time on the day he kissed her by the creek. And she thought that there are things in the world that remain exactly themselves no matter how much time passes over them, like foundation stones put in the ground with care, like the mountain standing patient and permanent to the west, like the specific feeling of being held by someone who knows every version of you and loves all of them. In the years that followed, the homestead continued to grow into itself. Hector grew into a serious, capable boy who showed the same natural affinity for carpentry that his father had, spending long hours in the workshop learning to work with wood, and producing increasingly competent small objects: a box for his mother, a stool for his sister, a rack for the barn wall that Isaiah praised and Sadie kept. Ruth grew into a relentlessly curious and somewhat imperious young person who wanted to know how everything worked and why, and who informed her parents at the age of 4 that she intended to be a doctor when she grew up, which neither of them found implausible. In 1891, a third child arrived, a boy they named James, who had Sadie's lighter coloring and Isaiah's build, and a temperament that was placid and sunny and utterly unlike either of his parents, which they found endlessly charming. He fit into the household with a smoothness that suggested he had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. And by the time he was walking, he had both his older siblings organized around him in the way of youngest children who are wholly beloved. The homestead that had been given to Sadie Beckett as a broken inheritance, the collapsed roof, and the warped walls and the porch rail lying in the dry grass, was, by the early years of the 1890s, one of the better maintained and more productive small ranches in La Plata County. The house had been expanded in 1890, with a proper front room added onto the original 2 rooms, giving the family space to live in rather than simply exist in. And Isaiah had built a set of bookshelves along the east wall of the new room where Sadie's growing collection of books lived, including 3 volumes on botany that she had ordered from a catalog, and that she used with practical application in the expanded kitchen garden. The water right they had fought for in 1885 held firm through all subsequent county reviews, and the creek ran along the eastern boundary of the Beckett homestead in the cottonwood shade, clear and reliable, exactly as it always had. On a September morning in 1893, exactly 10 years after they had married in the Durango church on a cloudless golden Saturday, Sadie woke to find Isaiah not in bed beside her. She lay still for a moment listening to the house. She could hear James in the next room and the distant sound of the barn, and then she got up and pulled on her dress and went out through the kitchen door into the September morning. Isaiah was sitting on the porch step, the porch that he had refloored in pale new boards that had now weathered to the same silver gray as the original wood, so you could not tell the old from the new anymore, and he was watching the sun come up over the mountains, which he occasionally did when something was on his mind or when nothing at all was on his mind and he simply wanted to be in the morning. Sadie sat down beside him on the step. "Thinking," she said. "Remembering," he said. 10 years today." She leaned against his shoulder. He was warm and solid, and he smelled like coffee and morning, and the mountains were turning from gray to pink to gold in the rising light, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to go yellow at the edges the way they did in September. "I am going to tell you something I have been thinking," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I used to lie awake sometimes in the early years after my father died," he said, "and think that the ranch was going to outlast me. That I would work it and improve it and then die, and it would go to someone who did not know what it was. I used to think that was just how it was, that was what happened to things." He was quiet for a moment. "Now I think about this place, and I think it is going to keep going for a very long time after us because it is already in Hector's hands, literally every time he goes into that workshop, and it will be in Ruth's hands and James's hands, and it did not have to be that way. It happened because you got on a stage with a deed in your pocket and refused to be defeated by a collapsed roof." Sadie was quiet for a moment. "It happened because you came through the cottonwoods," she said. "It happened because you got down from your horse and told me you knew every board of the place and asked if I would accept help." He turned to look at her. The sun was fully over the mountains now, and the light was clean and warm and specific, and it lit the side of his face the way it had been lighting it for 10 years of mornings, and she knew every detail of it the way you know things you have looked at with love for a long time. "We happened," he said. "We happened," she agreed, and leaned up and kissed him in the morning light, and across the yard Hector came out of the barn with a bucket and looked at his parents on the porch step, and made an extremely expressive face of 12-year-old mortification. And Ruth emerged behind him and looked at the same sight and said, with great satisfaction, "Good morning." And Isaiah laughed and Sadie laughed. and the homestead came awake around them in the September sun with the mountains standing in their permanent, generous way to the west, and the cottonwoods along the creek in their autumn gold, and the whole of it exactly as it was meant to be. There was a board in the floor of the front room that had a particular sound underfoot, a small creak that Sadie had noted the first time she heard it, and had never asked Isaiah to fix, because she had come to think of it as a signature, the specific voice of the house announcing itself when you walked across it. Every morning she walked over that board on her way to the kitchen, and it spoke its small word, and she answered it in her own way. With the coffee pot and the fire and the ordinary particular miracle of another day on ground that was hers and his and theirs, and built and rebuilt from its own breaking with work and honesty, and a love that had made itself out of all the same materials as everything else on the property, effort and care, and two people who showed up every morning willing to do what the day required. The broken homestead had been given to Sadie Beckett as an inheritance, and she had made it into a life, and every board of it knew her now as well as she knew it. And Isaiah Bishop was beside her in the work and in the morning, and in the long golden Colorado evenings when the mountains turned every color, and the children's voices came in through the open windows, and the lamplight was warm, and the story of the place was ongoing and good and entirely, completely theirs.